What is quality of hire?
We need to build a lean team. Every hire matters. So are we hiring the best people? The way that you approach measuring quality of hire and tackling it really depends on what your objective is.
People feel like they traded quality for growth in a way during that time.
If you have a random hiring process, you're going to get random results. If interviewers showing up late impacts drop-off rates, what drives an employee's contribution value to an organization is not one thing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hiring on All Cylinders. I'm your host, Chris Abbas, and today I'm in New York and joined by Ben Sesser, CEO of BrightHire, the interview intelligence software. How are you, Ben?
Good. How are you?
Great. So you were at the event that we held on the State of TA.
Yep.
And one of the big topics that came up was this confusion around quality of hire.
Yep.
And how the market has really shifted recently. You know, people are maybe hiring less. They're being more intentional with their hiring.
Yep.
They're focusing on efficiency and quality. But there seemed to be a lack of, I guess, people agreeing on what that meant.
Yep.
So I think today we're going to talk about something that I know you're passionate about and have some great ideas about, which is quality of hire. So as a starting point, what is quality of hire from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, at the very foundational level, quality of hire is meant to assess the value and the contribution that an employee brings to an organization over the long term, that furthers its long-term success and business goals. So how do we evaluate, the contribution, the value add of every new person that we're bringing into the organization so that we can optimize over time?
Mm-hmm. And why do you think there is this drive and this importance being placed on this metric? It seems to be everyone's talking about it. No one can agree on it.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is right now?
Yeah, back in vogue.
Yeah.
I think there's a few reasons for that. I think the main one, and look, quality of hire has been around for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I was on Google Scholar because I was curious, and it was referenced in academic studies in 1991.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's been around for a while as a term, and then since 2010, if you look at like the Google Trends, there's sort of like a steady climb. So it hasn't come out of left field. It's been around, and people have talked about it for a long time. But it's definitely been. I think it peaked in March on Google Trends, and the reason for that is coming out of there was this huge boom in hiring,
Mm-hmm.
Particularly in tech, and then we had a big pullback in that space. And the pullback was the result of valuation shifting from growth being what was valued highest from a valuations perspective to margin efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So the way companies were valued changed, and so the priorities of those companies changed accordingly. And a lot of leaders looked at the organization and realized that they had to become more efficient to realize valuations and to grow. And people are a big part of the equation when it comes to efficiency. And so there was a huge focus on one. Unfortunately, a bunch of companies cut back pretty substantially so they become more efficient. And the result of that was each incremental hire thereafter was way more important because you're not going to make quite as many of them. And I think also a lot of leaders looked at companies that made some pretty substantial changes and cuts
Mm-hmm.
and saw that they didn't fall apart. They pulled back and they got leaner, and they were still able to execute. And so there was definitely a conversation among leaders of companies about and kind of a drive towards building lean and more efficient teams overall,
Mm-hmm.
and that being a better path, not just because it's more efficient and there's less cost, but also potentially it helps with execution, right? There's less complexity. And so a lot of CEOs, a lot of leaders were having conversations internally that, we need to build a lean team. Every hire matters. So are we hiring the best people? How do we know we're hiring the best people? I heard that from, I talked to hundreds of TA leaders every month or two. And I heard that many times in a short period of time that CEOs were coming to them and saying, how do we know we're hiring the best? And the answer was, we're not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so step one is trying to assess and measure the quality of hire so that, we know, right? We know how we're doing from a effectiveness perspective, and we can optimize over time and make sure we're building these sort of lean, talented teams. So I think that was kind of the long arc of how the conversation sort of spiked back up in the last, year or so.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you speak, and some things come to mind is it feels like there's this acceptance, or this people feel like they traded quality for growth in a way during that time. But how much of it do you think is hiring lower quality candidates, just faster because they had to and because the market was maybe more competitive, against being an org design problem? Because I know one of the things that, some of the companies that did make huge cuts, there was this big level of middle management and people who weren't really executing or hands-on. Do you think we're solving the right problem here, against what you're talking about? And that's a question that comes to mind.
Yeah. If the question is, were teams and companies categorically hiring lower quality of people, I think the answer to that is no, right?
Mm-hmm.
The overall distribution of skills, competencies, and talent in the market, hasn't changed. It's not like everyone got less talented. I think it was more to do with, I think the org design point is a really important one. Mm-hmm. Companies were chasing growth, and in many areas that correlated to more headcount,
mm-hmm.
more headcount to build new product, more headcount to sell more headcount to do all the things that support, those functions. And when you had more headcount, you had more management because, people need to be managed, they need direction. And so it kind of builds on itself. So it's not necessarily that everyone was less talented, but I think you're right. There was an org design problem, but now it's also, when every hire matters because you're going to make fewer hires, you can't cover up mistakes, mm-hmm. right? And you have to have a higher bar and more consistency because the impact is going to be more pronounced in the organization.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's a shift away from these vanity metrics like headcount growth and valuations. It's about profitability and productivity and efficiency, which is actually, I think, a good thing.
Yeah.
And even though we're getting this pressure, and I think there's a lot of emphasis, this renewed emphasis on quality of hire, people are still struggling to figure out how to actually capture and measure it.
Yep.
I guess, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's such a mysterious metric that's time to hire as a pretty unified calculation, time to fill, all that kind of stuff?
Yep.
This seems to be one that we can't nail down. Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com.
It's simple in theory and, complex in practice for a bunch of reasons. The first is what drives an employee's contribution and value to an organization is not one thing, right? There's a multitude of factors that will influence that, right? Yes, the skills, competencies, capabilities they have relative to the role they're hired for, their onboarding, their manager, the environment that they operate in, and whether they're, going to be engaged because it's a good fit. So that's one thing. The second is, you measure it with metrics, right? And there's not, one single metric that is the perfect universal measure of somebody's contribution or value to a business across all teams and all job types. Second is that some of the most common metrics that folks do collect are subjective. So there's sort of noise in those metrics, right? Performance ratings are subjective. And you can be really, really specific around guiding folks to, give performance ratings, but it's still subjective. The third is if you're going to use a multitude of metrics, they come from different systems. You may or may not have them, so on and so forth. And then you have to get an organization aligned on it, right? With all that complexity, you then have to convince an organization, here's how we're going to do it and get everyone aligned and then operationalize it and do something with it. So there's a lot of pieces there. And so, it's complex. And I think that adds to the conversation and sort of uncertainty around how do I get started or what do we measure and how do we put it in practice?
And you speak to lots of talent leaders of all different shapes and sizes of organization. What are you seeing in the market in terms of how people are measuring this that you think, okay, this sounds like a pretty solid way of determining quality of hire? What are the things that you're seeing?
It's a great question. I will say that the way that you approach measuring quality of hire and tackling it really depends on what your objective is. So there's a few different ways that writ large, I would say folks go about it. Well, the first one I'll highlight is that they don't measure it. Right? A lot of companies don't measure quality of hire. So let's just be clear about that. And there's probably like 3 other buckets. One bucket is we're going to measure indicators of an employee's contribution value to the business over the long term, but we're going to do it in, a way that focuses on a particular job type or job family within the organization that's like critically important. And we're going to measure things that are very specific to that role.
Sure.
Do sales folks hit quota? Pretty, or time to resolution in a call center. The second one is we're going to pick a universal metric that's a long-term measure of contribution value add, so we can do apples to apples across the organization. And we're going to measure things like their performance ratings, their attrition, engagement, those sorts of things. And then the third is we're going to measure things that are a bit more short-term, which has a different objective. So short-term is actually you're measuring quality of hire as a TA metrics explicitly, and it has to do with, how effectively are we identifying good talent, getting them through our hiring funnel, making offers, and then you're measuring things that are a bit more short term. So you might measure things like, on-site to offer or on-site to hire, and then, sort of like pulse surveys 90 days in, how does the hiring manager feel about the hire? So I hesitate to say any of them are categorically right or wrong. It kind of depends on what the objective is.
Sure.
But a lot of folks don't measure any of them.
And you bring up a good point there, because it doesn't just start once people are in the company. It starts about how you attract, how you bring them through the process. And I know that that's an area that you're BrightHire helping with, and you're really passionate about. So can you maybe talk about the stuff that you're seeing from, and the ways that you help companies bring in high quality talent, and the things that you're seeing as being really effective for companies to do?
Yeah. So our role is let's control the process. So if you have a random hiring process, you're going to get random results. And if you have a more consistent and dialed in hiring process, you're going to get more consistent results. And, regardless how you measure quality of hire in the back end, and there's, again, no right or wrong per se. There's different ways you can do it. If you're not controlling the inputs, the hiring process, and creating excellence and consistency there, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to control and optimize the results that you get over the long term, regardless of what those results are. And so we really focus on how do we improve and drive excellence in the hiring process itself. And so that comes from a bunch of different pieces, right? One is know what you're looking for. When you're hiring, if you don't know what the right competencies, skills, traits are you're looking for, how can you identify them and have a good chance to hire the right folks? The second is how do we run a structured and consistent hiring process, assessment process? Lots of studies, but foundationally, if you run a structured interview process, if you are consistent in your execution, you're going to get more consistent, better results. How do you know what great sounds like and stay calibrated? It's great to run a consistent process, but if nobody knows how to evaluate talent, you don't have consistency in your rating scale. And then how do you measure, right? And so we help across that whole kind of value chain, solidifying the skills and competencies that you're looking to hire for, helping to operationalize structured, consistent interviews, making interviews better and more effective, helping to frame hiring decisions so that they're more skills-based and competency-based and based on evidence, and then ultimately measuring a bunch of data across the process that allows you to look back and improve, over the long term.
And a lot of those things that you mentioned, and I think the reason they fall down a lot is because humans are dealing with these things, typically. Humans are unpredictable, they're busy, they're rushing around, they maybe forget things. And I think that leads to a lot of the inconsistencies in processes historically. How does BrightHire solve that, or help hiring teams with that stuff that traditionally like human error?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our founding mission was to give everyone the hiring experience they deserve. And when we think about that, we're thinking about the candidate, of course, first, but we're also thinking about people in the hiring process. The hiring process, if you think about it, is perhaps the most important process in an organization for a company's long-term success. It might be the biggest process in terms of capital allocation. Think about it. And to your point, it's staffed by a team of volunteers. And if you step back and think about the fact that the most important process in your organization is staffed by volunteers that do it infrequently and that it's extremely hard, it's not necessarily a recipe for success. So one of the founding ideas of BrightHire was maybe technology can make people feel more effective and be better at something that's hard and they don't do all the time. And so the way that we do that is practically showing up in the flow of work as folks are doing the job of hiring and making them better, making it easier. So let's help you scope a role more effectively and really understand what you should be looking for. Let's help you build that interview plan in a few minutes to help you feel confident that you're assessing for the right things in the right way. Let's make it easy for you to run an interview. Let's, instead of having all the cognitive load of, I'm going to interview Chris and I'm going to try to write down everything he says like a stenographer and think of the last thing he said and try to remember what I was supposed to cover and, do all of that. Let's remove all that cognitive load. We'll take the notes for you automatically. We'll give you the guide front and center during the interview, and we'll help you, put your attention on the candidate so that you can run more consistently. And then let's capture this incredible context. A candidate has gone through our interview loop. They've shared all of these really important things about their qualifications. And let's make sure that doesn't get lost. And let's frame that up and summarize it and give it back to you as a hiring manager, as a hiring team, so you can, go back to the evidence and feel confident that you know what you know and you know what you don't know, and you can make a more informed choice. And then we capture a bunch of data and enable some training. So there's a lot of things involved in that, but foundationally it's show up and be helpful and make it easier for folks to be more effective across the process and run it more consistently.
Yeah. So being that co-pilot for teams as they go through that interview process.
Yeah.
Really cool. Okay. So yeah, one of the things that I think is really challenging at the moment in the process is people have got their notes all over the place.
Yep.
Very sporadic. And that's really hard to actually make incremental improvements over time and actually know what's working and what isn't. Because you can't spot trends, you can't measure the data, you can't think, okay, well, there's this candidate smash this interview process, and we're actually been getting really good candidates from this interview process. You can't see those things really, and it gets lost. So can you talk about some of the things that you do to allow leaders to improve process over time? And it'd be really interesting if you've got any stuff that you notice about any metrics or things that you've noticed throughout your data collection that's like, okay, this actually makes a really good interview process, or having this amount of interviews is like the best, or this length of screen is the best. That kind of stuff would be pretty cool to understand.
I mean, it's an old adage, if it's not measured, it can't be managed and certainly can't be optimized, right? And so collecting data and having access to information is kind of step one. There's two ways that we support that with our clients. There's the quantitative data, and I'll get to that in a second, and it's really, really interesting, and there's a lot you can do with it. There's also just the qualitative, right? The ability to to go back and watch the tape, to understand what did great actually sound like, or hey, we missed something with this candidate, evidently. How did we probe for that? What did it sound like? So that we can kind of continuously improve. So we can, again, it's a process staffed by volunteers. So how do we enable people to be great and coach them? And you can't do that if you can't observe behavior and understand. Then there's the data side. So we capture a lot of data about the interview process, which, in our view is like the heart of the hiring process. It drives every single outcome. So you have to understand what's happening. That data is like the dynamics of an interview. It's very, very simple things like the talk ratio between you and me, whether I exhibited certain behaviors that are good for candidate experience, like did I set an agenda? Did I give you time for questions? The dynamics, the rigor. Are we covering what we, kind of set out to cover? So we collect all of that. We pull in ATS data as well and kind of can pull it all together into some interesting insights. To your point, then you can start to connect what happens in interviews to outcomes. We have a lot of data in our product that's really interesting. We also do a lot of analysis across clients and surface some pretty interesting stuff. So a very simple example, to your point, we analyzed if interviewers showing up late impacts drop-off rates in the hiring process. And it turns out if any of the interviewers show up late to an interview, like the likelihood a candidate's going to drop or withdraw from the process goes up meaningfully.
Wow.
Like north of 20%, which is a pretty big deal. So that's a very simple example. Then we'll do things that are much more nuanced, or enable our clients to do so. So we can track whether or not certain topics and competencies were covered in interviews, and then ultimately connect those to outcomes, right? If you're tracking the data, you can understand, hey, we hired a cohort of folks. This is particularly useful if you're hiring many individuals in the same role, sales, call centers, so forth. There are folks that you objectively, might deem to be more successful, or folks that didn't end up being as successful, and we can look back and analyze, well, what happened? Is there some differences we can observe? And we have examples where clients actually identified that there were certain competencies or topics that, with higher performing cohorts, I'll give you a specific example if that's helpful. This topic is covered way more frequently, way more in depth, and with the less performing cohort, it wasn't. And so evidently that was an important thing for us to cover. And so let's put it front and center in the way that we assess, and let's really dial into what great sounds like and get it right. So, there's very simple examples, and then there's like much more nuanced examples.
And this is one of the things that's actually really interesting. You can't just take a process off the shelf and it be applicable for your company, because every company is different. They look at different things. They value different things. So having this data over time, you could create the perfect interview process for you.
Correct.
Which is, I think, very interesting and super valuable. And that stat about people showing up late, I mean, just imagine the value that lateness, the cost of that lateness over time at scale.
Yeah. As my co-founder likes to say, there is data that we collect that is akin to, in baseball, the advice like, don't close your eyes when you swing. It's like we can there are universal truths that certain behaviors are going to be beneficial or detrimental, particularly things around candidate experience, right?
Yeah.
So we measure a whole host of things that really speak to the candidate experience, not from an NPS survey that nobody will really fill out or a Glassdoor review, but just the actual, interactions within the interview itself. Not because interviewers are being nefarious. They don't do it all the time, right? So how do we help coach and nudge folks to do that? And then again, on the other end, there's much more complex, data analysis you can do with really interesting data around rigor and the things that we're actually assessing for that can enlighten actually like driving to quality of hire. Now, candidate experience drives quality hire as well, because if your great candidates drop out, that's not going to, that's detrimental, but really identifying like skills, competencies, how do we assess for them, and do they even connect to success long-term?
Something that's tangentially, I guess, linked to quality of hire. Have you heard about or had any experience with like fake candidates?
You heard about? Yes, we've heard about them. Yeah, a lot.
Now, we obviously have a community and we do dinners and we speak to a lot of executives, and this seems to be coming up more and more.
Yeah.
As a problem. Can BrightHire help with filtering those folks out? Like,
I never personally linked fake candidates to quality of hire, but when you think about it, hiring the complete wrong person would not be beneficial for your quality of hire. So I see the connection there. Actually, it's been a use case that, again, we didn't start BrightHire with the mission to eliminate fake candidates. We started with the mission to make hiring exceptional for everyone involved. Mm-hmm. But what we found is as this has become, more prevalent for a lot of our clients, particularly we have a lot of clients that are global and international. And so they're experiencing different things in different regions. But this is something that's coming up a lot. They're actually able to validate, the person that we spoke to the person that showed up on day one, or is the person that we spoke to in the screen, the person that showed up in the onsite, and they're finding differences. And they're also able to go back and understand if folks are kind of using answers that, might be coming from somebody else in the room, or or from ChatGPT or what have you. So again, not the intent when we started the company, but again, it is really important for giving the organization quality of hire for the experience that they want. And BrightHire has actually been a really, really valuable tool, for a lot of our clients for that, and it's definitely coming up quite a bit.
Yeah, and an intentional value add. It feels like something that I definitely didn't expect to be a problem for leaders, but I keep hearing it over and over again. So I guess in terms of moving forwards, like where do you see the future of quality hire going, and how companies are going to be looking at this like long term? Do you see anything exciting or anything that's in the works that can improve this for make this easier for leaders?
It's not going anywhere, right? It's been around since 1990.
Yeah.
Steady climb. It's obviously been in vogue. In particular, in the last year, there's derivative conversations like around talent density that are related. And at the end of the day, the value of a business is kind of the discounted future cash flows. Which to have cash flows, you need to be efficient and all that. So it's not going anywhere. And I do think that it will become easier to drive, to measure because of systems, not just BrightHire, but other systems. If you make it easier to collect data, and you can collect data, one of the nice things about BrightHire is it's data collection without changing what we're doing. We're just capturing what is happening, translating that into data, very actionable data that you can then use to improve over time. So that's beneficial. The extent to which there's systems like BrightHire. It's also beneficial that, it's just gotten easier to build software where you can collect data, get data out of it, bring data together. So, one of the historical challenges is we have, HRIS data, ATS data, now interview data itself, so forth. And, it's hard to bring it all together. That's going to get easier. The analysis is going to get easier. I think one of the really interesting use cases for AI, generative AI in particular, is data analysis. You can take data and you can ask questions of it and draw conclusions. So I think all of those things will make it easier for folks to really get started, get their arms around it, draw insight, and keep it to be a North Star metric in the organization.
Yeah. And one of the things that historically people have had a problem with interview process is creating a fair and unbiased process.
Yep.
So how does BrightHire help with that? Like how?
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So there's driving the behaviors that day in, day out actually either can facilitate, add to, or detract from an equitable process. And then there's, again, going back to data measurement, right?
Yeah.
Going back to data. And so we practically show up and help facilitate an interview process that is more likely to be equitable and reduce the space for bias. So one, running structured and consistent interviews that are focused on skills is really important if you want to run an equitable hiring process. And so we help build the plan, we show up, we help make sure that the interviews are structured and consistent. So that's super important. The second is historically, hiring decisions have been made based on, to your point, loose leaf pieces of paper and our memories and recollections, which are extremely ripe for bias, not necessarily nefarious, but just it really introduces a lot of space for that. And so BrightHire captures a candidate in their own words, brings that to the fore, one, so folks can check their own bias when they're making hiring decisions, and two, so that we can actually triangulate and bring other perspectives to the table. Hiring historically is unique in another sense in that it's a really, really important high value decision that has historically been made with nobody sharing the same actual context, right? You had a conversation, Ben had a conversation. Those were different conversations. We can't see them. And so we're trading our recollections. And so if we bring actual evidence, transparency to the table, that's really important. And the last piece is data. We capture data about the consistency and rigor of the interview process. And part of that data speaks to how does that process unfold the same or differently based on the backgrounds of the candidate, the interviewers, and the dynamics therein. I mentioned that we do a lot of data analysis in the product. We also do a lot of data analysis that we sort of share with the community. And a lot of the data analysis that we've shared relates to, for instance, like gender dynamics in the interview process. And, gender dynamics, as we've found in a multitude of, analysis we've done, drive different behavior. Like gender pairings interact differently throughout the process. And so capturing that data so that you can actually like see it and act on it and know where to lean in, and surfacing it, which we do in our product, is essential. Otherwise, it's a black box and we really don't know what's happening. And we're relying on very derivative metrics to try to understand if there's bias in our process. And then we don't really understand what to do about it because we don't know why it's happening.
Yeah, I bet you see a trend of like if you have a female candidate having no female in the interview loop versus having a female in the interview loop. I bet that makes stuff like that.
I mean, talk ratios are different depending on the gender dynamics of the interview panel. The questions that are asked by the interviewer and actually by the candidate are different. For instance, we did an analysis of sales hiring loops, and we found that female interviewers were vastly more likely to be asked questions about compensation. Whether it was the recruiter screen, hiring manager screen, that was just the case. We also found differences in the way candidates were assessed based on the gender of the interviewer. Like male interviewers tended to focus much more on like, what have you done and what do you know? And female interviewers tended to focus much more on what is your potential and what are you looking for? What do you care about? The outlier being female interviewers in sales interview processes were also much more likely to really drill into like the metrics, like what did you hit quota, so on and so forth. But generally, it was a very stark difference. And so you have to be able to measure those things to understand what's happening in the process and drive change.
That's really interesting. And I bet it's super useful for companies. So to finish up, like you obviously talk to lots of leaders. You're building your own company in this space.
Yep.
You're seeing a lot of the innovation that's happening. What are you most excited about in regards to TA?
I mean, I think it's a lot of what we've talked about.
Yeah.
I have such a deep passion and appreciation for TA, for folks in the profession. before I was in recruiting in the TA space, my first passion was around like careers and education. Why? Because that influences the profession that you have, your mobility economically, your life, really. And even though it's this incredibly strategic and very important role in a business and shapes your success, I mean, full stop, a lot of the work historically associated with TA was administrative, like tedious, and so forth. And a lot of it's hard because you had no visibility, and it is staffed by an army of volunteers. So technology, to the extent that we can shift the balance of the work pretty decidedly away from administrative and tedious and so forth, which is just, it's the nature of the role, right? You have to do certain things to get candidates through the process and make hires. The more we can diminish that and elevate the strategic side of the function and of the profession, and then the more we can give visibility and data to folks in TA, it really fundamentally changes the role in hopefully a very exciting way. So I think that's the thing that I'm most excited about, is the role for technology specifically to really fundamentally change the balance of what the role is and what the function does on a day-to-day basis towards the maximally high leverage things and away from the sort of like low leverage and administrative work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very clear that the role in TA is going to change dramatically over the next 3 to 5 years.
Yes.
And finally, where can people find you? Find BrightHire? Find more information.
Well, you can find me in New York City. No, BrightHire. Yeah, we're BrightHire.com or .ai. You can go to either. That's our website. You can find us on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, and I share a lot of the data that we talked about. That's one of the things that we are very committed to, is we have all this incredible data that we have access to. So it's kind of our responsibility to not just put it in our product, but actually just to share best practices with the community, because ultimately it drives everyone to be better. And so you can find me on LinkedIn. Please connect with me. I share content pretty frequently. We think it's pretty interesting and pretty valuable.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That was super insightful. I really enjoyed that conversation. And if you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes.